Roger disappeared without a trace. His car was still in the driveway, and not a single thing was missing from the house, Mr. Whitaker said, his gruff voice cutting through the warm air of their dining room. His words hung in the space between us, heavy and unsettling, like the echo of something that was better left forgotten. Alara and I had just moved to this quiet little town, far from the suffocating grip of our religious families. Their disapproval of us living together without being married had turned into a campaign of harassment, constant calls, letters, and even visits from members of their church. It reached the point where we couldn't take it anymore. We scraped together every last dollar we had, and by some stroke of luck, we found a house at an unbelievable price. The young couple selling it had been oddly eager to close the deal, rushing through every step of the process. But at the time, we didn't question it. We saw it as our chance for a fresh start. Now here we were, having dinner with Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker, the elderly couple next door. They'd invited us over as a welcome gesture, and we couldn't resist the opportunity to make some connections in this unfamiliar place. He was the owner before the young couple, Mr. Whitaker continued, swirling his wine absent-mindedly. They didn't last long in the house either, barely a year before they packed up and left. But hey, who am I to judge? His eyes flicked toward Mrs. Whitaker briefly before he took a long sip of wine. Alara's hand found mine under the table, her fingers tightening slightly. Did anyone ever figure out what happened to Roger? She asked cautiously, her voice laced with hesitancy. Mr. Whitaker shook his head slowly. Nope. It's like he just vanished one day. Gone. Mrs. Whitaker chimed in, her tone soft and reassuring. Now, don't let him scare you. Roger was a strange man, always kept to himself. Sometimes people just want to disappear and start over somewhere new. It's a quiet, beautiful town. Nothing bad ever happens here. Their words stayed with us long after we thanked them for their hospitality and walked back to our new home. The story lingered in my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove, but as the days turned into weeks, life in the house became routine. We loved its quirks, the creaking stairs, the sprawling attic, the big bay windows that let in just the right amount of light. It felt like the fresh start we had been dreaming of. 3 months passed, and everything seemed normal. Then, one evening, everything changed. We were getting ready for dinner at a little restaurant we'd started calling our spot. I was digging through the closet in our bedroom, trying to find something decent to wear, when I noticed it, a small, pale blue door, no taller than 4 feet, standing inconspicuously behind the hanging clothes. Its faded paint was chipped and peeling, revealing layers of darker wood underneath. I froze, my hands still clutching a hanger. There was no way this door had been there before. My heart started to race as I stared at it, my mind struggling to reconcile its sudden appearance. Alara, I called, louder than I meant to. Come here. She appeared moments later, her arms sliding around my waist as she gave me a playful hug from behind. What's up? She asked, her voice light, but it faltered when she followed my gaze. What the hell is that? We both stood there, silent, staring at the door. I had used this closet every day for months. There was no way I could have missed it. It's probably just storage or something, I said, though I didn't believe my own words. My voice wavered with uncertainty. Alara shook her head, her expression uneasy. Finn, there's no way we wouldn't have noticed this. It wasn't here before. Her voice dropped to a whisper. This is wrong. My curiosity overpowered my fear. I reached out and gripped the doorknob. It felt cold and smooth in my hand. With a slow, deliberate motion, I pulled it open. The door swung noiselessly on its hinges, revealing a small, dimly lit room. It was no larger than a child's bedroom, its walls bare and gray. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, its faint light barely illuminating the space. The room was empty, devoid of any furniture, shelves, or clues about its purpose. It's just storage, I muttered again, though the words felt hollow. Alara stepped closer, peering inside without crossing the threshold. Her arms crossed tightly over her chest. I don't like this, she said flatly. It doesn't make sense, Finn. We left the door alone after that, too unsettled to investigate further. As the days passed, it became easier to dismiss it as some odd, forgotten feature of the house. But a week later, the house reminded us that it wasn't done with us yet. Alara was at work, and I was home alone, tidying up the bedroom. I reached into the closet to hang a shirt, and my breath caught in my throat. The door was gone. I shoved the clothes aside, my hands trembling as I felt along the back wall of the closet. It was smooth and solid, completely ordinary. There was no sign the door had ever been there. My heart pounded as I stumbled out of the closet, my mind racing. When Alara came home, I was sitting in the kitchen, nursing my third beer of the evening. She could tell something was off the moment she walked in. "Rough day?" she asked, setting her bag down on the counter. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," I said, shaking my head. "You just have to see it." I led her to the bedroom, my stomach twisting in knots. But when we turned the corner, we both froze. The pale blue door was back, standing exactly where it had been before, as though it had never disappeared. Alara and I exchanged a glance, the unspoken question in her eyes mirroring the one in mine. What is happening? Without waiting, I reached for the door again. The handle felt even colder this time, almost icy. I pulled it open, bracing for whatever was on the other side. It wasn't the same room. Instead of the small, empty space we'd seen before, there was a study, a cozy, dimly lit room that looked like something out of an old mystery novel. A wooden desk stood in the center, scratched and weathered with age, its surface cluttered with faded papers, a quill pen, and an unlit oil lamp. Bookshelves lined the walls, packed with volumes that seemed ready to crumble at the slightest touch. A spiral staircase rose from the corner of the room, curling upward into darkness. "Holy shit," Alara whispered, stepping past me into the room. "Be careful," I cautioned, but I followed her in any way, unable to resist the magnetic pull of the strange, hidden space. The air inside was cool and carried a faint, metallic tang. The light from the single bulb in the closet didn't extend far into the room, leaving the corners shrouded in shadow. Alara reached for one of the books on the shelf, her fingers brushing against the cracked leather spine of a heavy tome. "I don't recognize these titles," she said, pulling a book down. She opened it to a random page, and her eyes widened. "This is wrong." I leaned over her shoulder to read. The book looked like a perfectly normal copy of The Return of the King, but when I skimmed through the pages, the story had changed. Frodo didn't destroy the One Ring. Instead, he succumbed to its power, and Sauron reclaimed it. Middle-earth fell into eternal darkness. The words were written in Tolkien's style, every sentence as vivid and masterful as the original, but the story was twisted into something horrifying. "Check another one," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Alara grabbed a worn copy of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages. "In this version," she said, her voice shaking, "Alice doesn't escape Wonderland. She becomes a prisoner, and the world around her turns into a nightmare she can never wake from." Every book we pulled from the shelves told a familiar story with a macabre twist. To Kill a Mockingbird ended with the town turning against Atticus Finch, leaving Scout abandoned in a hateful, broken community. The Great Gatsby described a version of events where Gatsby's obsessive pursuit of Daisy ended in her violent death at his hands. We sat there for hours, paging through the corrupted stories, the unease in the room thickening with every turn of the page. When we finally left, our minds were spinning, and our conversation circled back to the same question over and over. What is this place? The door and its secrets consumed us over the following weeks. We visited the study almost every night, combing through the shelves and examining the room inch by inch. We discovered a hidden compartment in the desk, which contained a single, untitled leather-bound book. Its pages were filled with cryptic stories and poetry, the meanings of which eluded us entirely. One poem in particular stuck with me. "Beneath the surface, truths lie still. Reflected worlds that twist the will. A door to shadows, a mirror snare. Step inside, if you dare." One night, Alara woke me in the middle of the night. "It's back," she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't need to ask what she meant. I followed her down the hall to the living room, where the pale blue door now stood behind the television. Its faded paint seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight streaming through the window. "I don't want to open it," she said. I hesitated. But the door, as terrifying as it was, also held an irresistible allure. Without another word, I reached for the handle. This time, the door led to something entirely new, an observatory. The room was vast, with a high-domed ceiling of glass. A massive telescope stood in the center, surrounded by scattered star charts and ancient-looking instruments. The sky beyond the dome wasn't our sky. The constellations were unrecognizable, the stars pulsing with an unnatural light. In the distance, I could see planets, some shattered into fragments, their molten cores glowing like dying embers, others teeming with strange, chaotic life. "This isn't right," Alara said, her voice barely audible. "This isn't our world." I approached the telescope, my heart pounding. Looking through the lens, I saw things I couldn't comprehend. A black star pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. A colossal structure drifting in space, its shape constantly shifting as if alive. When I pulled away, I realized I was shaking. "We shouldn't be here," I said. "We need to leave." The pale blue door began to appear more frequently after that night. It moved around the house, showing up in random places, inside closets, behind furniture, even in the bathroom. Every time we opened it, it led somewhere new, a maze of mirrors that reflected impossible versions of ourselves, a library filled with books that whispered when we touched them, a cavernous room where the walls seemed to breathe. Each new room felt like it was pulling us deeper into a world we didn't belong in, one that seemed to warp reality itself. The house became a maze, the door a gateway to something vast and unknowable. One night, after another disorienting journey through the door, Alara turned to me, her face pale. "I think we're being watched," she said. I wanted to dismiss her fear, but deep down, I felt it too. There was something about the door, an intelligence, a presence, something that was aware of us and was toying with us. We decided to contact the Whitakers. If anyone knew more about the history of the house, it would be them. The following weekend, we invited the Whitakers over for dinner. We kept the conversation light at first, chatting about the neighborhood and sharing stories about adjusting to life in a new town. But as the evening wore on, I brought up the house. "Mr. Whitaker," I started cautiously, "you mentioned Roger, the man who owned the house before us. Did he ever talk about anything unusual?" His hand froze mid-reach for his wine glass, and for a fleeting moment, his expression darkened. Mrs. Whitaker interjected quickly, her tone almost too bright. "Oh, you're probably just getting used to the old place. Every house has its quirks, right?" "That's not what I asked," I pressed, trying to keep my voice steady. Mr. Whitaker sighed, placing his glass down with a deliberate slowness. "Look, Roger was peculiar. He kept to himself, didn't talk much. But he wasn't crazy, if that's what you're asking." Alara leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly. "Did he say anything about doors?" Both Whitakers went very still. Mrs. Whitaker's smile faltered, and Mr. Whitaker glanced toward her before replying. "Not directly," he said finally, his voice low. "But he was obsessed with the house. Said it was alive. Used to claim it didn't belong here, that it came from somewhere else." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean, somewhere else?" Mr. Whitaker hesitated, clearly reluctant to say more. "He said it was connected to other places, other realities. Told us there were rules you had to follow. Said the house would test you." "Rules?" Alara asked, her voice trembling. He nodded. "Don't open a door unless you're ready for what's on the other side. Never stay too long. And whatever you do, don't try to leave something behind." The conversation left us shaken. After the Whitakers left, Alara and I sat in silence, the weight of their words settling over us like a heavy fog. That night, I dreamed of the pale blue door. In my dream, it opened by itself, revealing an endless void. A voice whispered my name, but when I turned to look, there was no one there. The next morning, Alara told me she'd had the same dream. That day, we resolved to leave the house. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't safe. But when I tried to call a realtor, The phone line went dead. My cell phone wouldn't dial out either. Every attempt ended with static or strange, distorted voices. When we tried to drive into town, the car wouldn't start. It was as if the house was trapping us, refusing to let us go. The pale blue door appeared in the kitchen that evening. It stood there, ominous and unyielding, as if daring us to open it. "We can't keep running from it," Alara said, her voice barely audible. "If we're stuck here, we need to figure out what it wants." I wanted to argue, to tell her we should ignore it, but deep down, I knew she was right. The house wasn't going to let us go unless we faced whatever was waiting behind that door. This time, the door led to what looked like an endless hallway. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one pristine and polished to a perfect shine. As we stepped inside, the air grew colder, and the sound of our footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the hallway was stretching farther with every step. At first, the mirrors reflected us perfectly, showing our hesitant movements and anxious expressions. But as we walked, the reflections began to change. In one mirror, I saw myself, but my reflection was smiling a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far. In another, Alara's reflection wasn't walking beside me. Instead, it stood still, staring at me with hollow, sunken eyes. "Finn," Alara whispered, grabbing my arm. "Look." I turned to see what she was pointing at. One of the mirrors showed a scene from our past, the day we moved into the house. But something was off. In the reflection, there was a shadow standing behind us, watching as we carried boxes through the front door. "That wasn't there," I said, my voice trembling. "It wasn't. It couldn't have been." The mirrors grew more distorted the farther we walked. Some showed us as children, others showed us older, with faces I barely recognized. One mirror displayed a version of me that was covered in burns, staring blankly at the floor. Another showed Alara crouched in a corner, crying, her hands stained with blood. "Let's go back," Alara pleaded. "We've seen enough." But when we turned around, the door was gone. Panic set in. The hallway seemed endless now, the mirrors reflecting versions of us we didn't want to see. The air grew heavier, and a low, guttural sound echoed in the distance, like something dragging itself toward us. "We need to keep moving," I said, grabbing Alara's hand. We broke into a run, the sound growing louder with every step. The mirrors began to shatter as we passed, the shards falling away to reveal nothing but blackness behind them. I could feel something following us, its presence a heavy, suffocating weight pressing against my back. Finally, up ahead, a light appeared, a faint, flickering glow. We sprinted toward it, desperate to escape. The light grew brighter, and then, suddenly, the hallway ended. We burst through another door, stumbling into a large, cavernous room. The walls were lined with shelves, each one holding hundreds of jars filled with swirling, silvery liquid. At the center of the room stood a massive mirror, taller than any we had seen before. Its surface shimmered like water, rippling slightly as we approached. "Is this the end?" Alara asked, her voice shaky. Before I could answer, the mirror rippled again, and something began to emerge from its surface. The surface of the mirror shimmered and bulged outward, as if something massive was pressing against it from the other side. Alara and I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. A dark shape began to emerge, a humanoid figure, impossibly tall and grotesquely thin, its body bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. Its face was smooth and featureless, save for two hollow depressions where eyes should have been. It stepped out of the mirror soundlessly, its presence overwhelming the room with an oppressive, suffocating weight. The jars lining the shelves began to shake, their contents swirling violently. A deep, resonant voice echoed in my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. "You have seen too much." Alara gasped, clutching my arm. "Finn, we need to run." But I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were encased in concrete. The figure tilted its head, as if observing us, and then it raised one spindly arm, pointing directly at me. "You opened the door. Now you will answer." The room seemed to tilt and warp as the figure's presence intensified. The shelves collapsed one by one, the jars shattering and spilling their shimmering liquid across the floor. The substance moved unnaturally, flowing toward the mirror like a living thing. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like a hook pulling at something deep inside me. My vision blurred, and the room around me faded. I wasn't standing in the cavernous room anymore. I was somewhere else. I was in a vast expanse of gray nothingness. The ground beneath me was smooth and cold, stretching endlessly in every direction. Above me, the sky was a swirling mass of dark clouds, punctuated by flashes of eerie, violet light. The figure was there too, standing a few feet away, its hollow face fixed on me. "You cannot leave," it said, its voice now audible but no less invasive. "Not until you understand." "Understand what?" I shouted, my voice echoing strangely in the emptiness. "What do you want from us?" It raised its arm again, and suddenly, the air around me shifted. I was no longer in the gray void. I was back in our house, but it was wrong. The walls were warped, the furniture melted and twisted into grotesque shapes. The pale blue door was everywhere, scattered across every surface like a broken pattern. I heard Alara screaming in the distance. I ran toward the sound, but the hallway stretched and changed with every step, twisting into impossible angles. Her screams grew louder, more desperate, until I finally burst into the living room. She was there, standing in front of one of the doors. But she wasn't alone. The figure stood behind her, its hand resting on her shoulder. Alara turned to look at me, and my heart dropped. Her eyes were gone, just empty sockets staring back at me. Her mouth opened, and she spoke in a voice that wasn't hers. "It's your fault, Finn. You brought us here." "No!" I shouted, stepping toward her. But as I reached for her, the room dissolved again, and I was back in the gray void. The figure loomed over me, its presence crushing. "You do not belong here," it said. "But you opened the door. You let us in." I felt a surge of anger rise within me. "We didn't know," I shouted. "We didn't ask for any of this." It tilted its head, as if amused. "Ignorance does not absolve you. The house is a vessel, a bridge between worlds. You were warned, yet you stayed. You explored. You trespassed." The ground beneath me began to ripple, and I realized I was sinking. The gray surface pulled at my feet like quicksand, dragging me down. I struggled, but it was no use. "You are part of it now," the figure said, its voice fading as the grayness swallowed me whole. "You will always be part of it." I woke up on the floor of the cavernous room, gasping for air. Alara was beside me, shaking me violently. Finn, wake up." I sat up, my head spinning. The room was back to normal, or as normal as it could be. The mirror stood silent and still, its surface no longer rippling. The shattered jars were gone, and the shelves were intact. "Are you okay?" Alara asked, her face pale. I nodded weakly, though I didn't feel okay. Something inside me had shifted, a deep, gnawing sense of wrongness that I couldn't shake. "We need to get out of here," I said. Together, we stumbled back toward the pale blue door. It led us back to the kitchen, and for a moment I thought we were safe. But then I noticed the faint, shimmering outline of the door still lingering in the air, like a shadow that refused to fade. Over the next few days, the house grew more hostile. The door appeared everywhere, sometimes multiple times in the same room. It was always there, watching, waiting. The sounds started next, whispers in the walls, faint knocking in the middle of the night, and, worst of all, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Alara and I tried to leave again, but the house wouldn't let us. Every attempt ended in failure, locked doors, dead engines, even missing shoes when we tried to walk. It was as if the house was alive, tightening its grip on us with every passing moment. One night, I heard Alara talking in her sleep. I shook her awake, but she didn't recognize me at first. Her eyes were wide and glassy, her voice trembling as she whispered, "It's not just the house. It's in us, Finn. It's in us now." Alara's words haunted me. "It's in us now." I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I knew she was right. The house had taken hold of us in ways we couldn't fully comprehend. We weren't just trapped, we were changing, becoming part of whatever was controlling this place. That night, the door appeared in our bedroom. Alara and I stared at it for what felt like hours, neither of us daring to move. Finally, she whispered, "We have to do something. We can't keep running from it." "We've tried everything," I said, my voice breaking. "What else is there?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We go through it. One last time. We find the source and we end it." I didn't want to argue. I didn't want to go through that door ever again. But I knew she was right. If we didn't confront it, we would never escape. We armed ourselves with anything we could find: a flashlight, a kitchen knife, an old crowbar from the garage. It felt absurd, like bringing toys to fight a monster, but it was all we had. Together, we opened the door. It led us to a vast, dark chamber unlike anything we'd seen before. The floor was smooth and reflective, like black glass, and the walls seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. At the center of the room stood a massive, glowing structure, a jagged, crystalline pillar that radiated an eerie, shifting light. The figure from the mirror was there, standing motionless beside the pillar. Its featureless face turned toward us as we entered, and I felt that familiar weight settle over me, suffocating and relentless. "You came," it said, its voice echoing in our minds. "Good. It is time." "Time for what?" Alara demanded, her voice trembling but steady. The figure didn't answer directly. Instead, it gestured toward the pillar. Images began to flicker across its surface, scenes from the rooms we had visited, the twisted versions of familiar stories, the strange worlds we had glimpsed through the telescope. And then it showed us ourselves, walking through the house, opening doors, crossing thresholds we never should have crossed. "You are the bridge," the figure said. "The door exists because you opened it. Your curiosity gave it power. Your fear sustains it." Alara's grip tightened on the knife in her hand. "If we're the bridge, then how do we close it?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering her question. "Sacrifice," it said simply. "A life for a life. The house demands balance." A cold dread washed over me. "You want us to kill each other?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it stepped aside, revealing another door behind the pillar. This one was different, larger, darker, its surface rippling like liquid shadow. "Enter, and the house will let you go. But only one of you may leave." Alara and I stared at the door, the weight of the figure's words crushing us. "There has to be another way," I said, my voice shaking. "There is not," the figure replied. "The house does not forgive. It only takes." For a long time, neither of us moved. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the pillar and the pounding of my heart. Finally, Alara stepped forward. "No," I said, grabbing her arm. "We'll find another way." There isn't another way, Finn," she said, her voice breaking. "You know that. If one of us has to go, it's going to be me." I shook my head violently. "No." "We'll fight it. Together." She turned to me, tears streaming down her face. "Finn, please. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Before I could stop her, she broke free of my grip and ran toward the door. I shouted her name, but it was too late. She stepped through, and the door slammed shut behind her. The room fell silent. The figure turned to me, its hollow face unreadable. "It is done," it said. "You're free." I woke up in our bedroom alone. The pale blue door was gone. The house was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. I stumbled through the empty halls, calling Alara's name, but there was no response. The house felt normal, as if everything that had happened was just a bad dream. But it wasn't. I sold the house a few weeks later. I didn't tell the realtor or the new owners about what had happened. I told myself it was because they wouldn't believe me, but the truth was, I didn't want to think about it anymore. I just wanted to leave it behind. Years have passed, but I can't forget. I dream about the door sometimes. In my dreams, I see Alara standing on the other side, staring back at me with empty eyes. I hear her voice calling my name, but I can never reach her. A few months ago, I looked up the house online. It's still standing. A new family lives there now. A man, a woman, and their 2 children. They look happy in the photos. But every time I look at that house, I feel it watching me, waiting. If you ever find a door where there shouldn't be one, a door that doesn't belong, don't open it. Some doors are meant to stay closed.